What would you do if no one was watching? Not when the spotlight is hungry for your smile, or when good manners are currency, but when the room is empty, the door is closed, and the only judge you'll face is the one who stares back at you in the mirror. Would you still choose what's right? Would you still turn down the easy win? Or would you finally let yourself reach for the shortcut you've been pretending you didn't see? People swear they know the answer. They say it with practiced certainty, with the pride of someone who's never had to field test their principles. But there's a difference between saying you are honest and paying the cost of being honest. The cost is where most people quietly bow out. For Amara woke, that cost arrived on the day she thought her life would change. The glass facade at the end of the street rose like a polished promise, reflecting a restless morning sky. Amara tightened her grip on a worn brown folder and listened to the timed, rehearsed click of her heels. She'd pressed her blazer 3 times before sunrise, picked loose threads from her skirt, and made a quiet pact with herself in the mirror. Today, you will not fold. She reached the gate with 8 minutes to spare. 8 minutes that felt like a lifeline. Then a shadow drifted into her path. An older woman with cautious steps and a tired spine, balancing a metal basin of water on her head. Bare feet, faded wrapper. The basin tilted a fraction with each step as if arguing with gravity. "My daughter," the woman rasped, eyes shining the way old eyes sometimes do, full of history and ache. "Please, help me carry this. My knees, they don't listen to me anymore." Amara's pulse tripped. The building loomed like a clock face. 8 minutes, 7:32. She smiled the way people smile when they feel cornered by kindness. "Ma, I'm sorry. I can't right now. I have an interview. Maybe ask someone else." The woman's gaze lingered just for a moment on Amara's face, as if memorizing something she recognized. Then she nodded. "All right, my child, go well." Amara's steps resumed faster. The internal monologue began its courtroom defense. "You can't help everyone. There are dozens of people on this street. If you miss this interview, who will help you? Focus, keep walking." Further down the road, another woman hustled toward the same building. Ezinne shoes, scuffed at the toes, handbag clutched close like an oath she refused to lose. When she found the older woman swaying under the basin's weight, she didn't check the time. She didn't weigh the math of goodness against risk. "Oh, Mama, let me," Ezinne said, already taking the basin with a careful lift. Water sloshed, found a seam in resolve, and chilled her blouse and skirt. She flinched, then steadied, shoulders absorbing the weight. Steps threading the path to a small stall near the wall. When they reached it, she set the basin down, chest heaving, clothes clinging like a second skin. "May you find favor today," the older woman whispered, her palm warm on Ezinne's wrist. "May those who look down on you be the ones to look up." "Amen," Ezinne breathed, not because she was religious, but because the blessing fell like water on dry ground. She turned and hurried, leaving a small constellation of wet footprints on the polished floor inside. The waiting room was a hive trying not to buzz. Polished shoes, tailored confidence, smiles like sealed envelopes. Amara took a seat, spine straight, heartbeat steady. Ezinne slipped into the last chair, damp hem whispering against tile. A man in a navy suit smirked, voice pitched to be overheard. "Did someone swim here?" Laughter shook loose from a few corners. Amara didn't join, but she didn't stop it either. She told herself people sharpen their edges when they're afraid. That was all this was. Fear with a cologne. They were called in one by one. Chinedu with his 2 master's degrees and well-fed opinions. A woman named Kendra whose laugh was rehearsed, bright and strategically placed. A man called Dapo who spoke softly but stacked his sentences with citations and phrases that felt like they'd been pre-assembled by a committee of mentors. Then Amara, careful and composed. Then Ezinne, humble and plain-spoken, hands folded to hide a tremor she couldn't suppress. When it was over, nobody could say quite what had happened because nothing much had happened. Questions, answers, smiles. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." But something else had unfolded that morning out of sight. Some hinges creaked in a room no one had visited yet. A test had been set. A quiet trap, the kind made not to catch you, but to reveal you. Days were slow afterward, the way days are slow when they're waiting to deliver news. Amara kept her phone near, but tried to forget it existed. She inventoried her hope like groceries, convincing herself there was more left in the cupboard than there really was. Ezinne sold provisions beside her mother, who moved with the careful grace of someone who had grown resilient by necessity. Dapo volunteered opinions to anyone who would sit still. Kendra sent emails to a network whose replies were all warmth and very little action. Chinedu added that interview to his running tally of places that would be lucky to have him. Then, at a half-remembered hour on a day that felt like all the others, Edzinne's phone blinked awake with a message that began with her name. "Dear Miss Opara, congratulations." She didn't scream. Not at first. She just stared, as if the words would dissolve if she moved too quickly. Then she ran, uneven footsteps and laughter colliding, and her mother met her at the doorway with a question that turned into a cry. They prayed, not the kind of prayer that asked for miracles, the kind that said thank you for a door that had finally admitted the knock had been there all along. The second stage of the process was set for a morning that wore its sky in a serious mood. The waiting room felt tighter, as if the walls had leaned in to eavesdrop. Fewer candidates now, purer air, sharper eyes. The HR director entered with a tall man in his late 50s. The man's presence changed the temperature in the room without saying a word. People straighten around people like him. Command without effort, quiet without apology. "You're here," the HR director said, voice even, "because we believe you can contribute in ways that matter." He called the first name. Kendra stood, adjusting a red blazer as if taking position on a stage. Inside the interview room, her answers were a choreography, clean, glittering steps, all landing where they were meant to. When the questions paused, the director stood, went to a cupboard, and returned with a stack of dusty folders and a tight stack of sealed envelopes. "I need these shredded," he said. "Open each envelope before discarding. If you find anything that looks important, bring it back. When you're done, return here." Kendra blinked. The word shredder didn't fit the image she'd built of herself inside this company. "You want me to?" She caught herself, smile, adjust the tone. "Of course." The shredding room was colder than it needed to be. The machine hummed like an engine, pretending not to be impatient. Kendra opened the first envelope. Dust, an old invoice, another. Memos, stapled at odd angles. Then the fourth, crisp edges shift in weight. That unmistakable hush of money when it touches air. A neat bundle of $100 bills, 10 of them. She closed the envelope, heartbeat tapping questions in her throat. The camera in the corner stared with the blank politeness of a fixed eye. She tilted her head to test where the blind spot might be. If this is a test, it's childish, she decided. And if it isn't a test, then someone was careless. Why should I be punished for someone else's carelessness? Her fingers moved before her conscience could answer. The money disappeared into her purse with the speed of a professional sleight of hand. She finished the shredding, smoothed her skirt, and returned to the conference room with her smile politely locked in place. "Anything important in the envelopes?" the director asked without looking up. "No," she said, steady as a heartbeat. "Nothing at all. Thank you. Send in the next candidate." Dapo walked in with a nod that managed to be both respectful and fraternal, as if he and the director shared a private understanding. He handled the questions like a seasoned driver in familiar streets, confident turns, measured speed, a flair for anticipating what would be around the next corner. Then the stack of folders, the envelopes, the same instruction. "Ah," he said lightly, "a practical exercise." In the shredding room, he found the money in his fifth envelope. He did not smile. He did not frown. He did what he was good at. He evaluated what the moment required and split himself into the man who would return, the money if asked, and the man who would keep it if no one remembered to inquire. When he returned, the director asked the question. Dapo reached into his pocket and produced the bundle, carefully composed. "I found this. I assumed it was misfiled." "Thank you," the director said. No praise, no extra warmth. Just a nod that parked itself in an unreadable space. Amara's turn tasted like metal. She sat, answered, breathed, didn't quite believe herself, but didn't let that reach her voice. When the director placed the stack before her, she registered the tightness in his mouth. Fatigue, annoyance, or nothing at all, just the natural gravity of someone who makes decisions that rearrange lives before lunch. In the shredding room, the machine's teeth clicked and whirred, while doubts narrated a split screen of futures. If you found money, what then? What would you say? Who are you when no one is watching? She didn't find cash in the first envelope, or the second, or the third. The fourth held a dry contract where signatures should have been. The fifth contained paper clips that had learned to rust. The sixth was heavier. She knew it before she opened it. The way people know when a silence is about to reveal itself as speech. The money met her fingers like something alive. 10 neat bills, the kind that feel both clean and untouchable. Rent, food, the course you've been eyeing. A month's worth of not having to calculate humility at the grocery counter. She stared long enough for the first answer to arrive. No one will know. Her father's voice followed. Not his sound, he'd been gone too long for that, but the shape of his sentences, that steady way he spoke about what doesn't bend, even when everything else does. Integrity isn't a performance, Amara. It's what you decide when the lights are off. She put the money back, carried the envelope to the door, then stopped. There's a way to do things that hints at guilt. Averted eyes, quick hands. She wasn't going to feed suspicion with small, nervous movements. She set the envelope on top of the stack, balanced it against her hip, and walked into the hallway with the unhurried calm of a person who doesn't owe anyone a story. In the interview room, she placed the envelope on the desk. This was inside one of the envelopes, she said. Not apology, not pride, a fact delivered by a person who had decided to be finished with the matter the moment she let go. The director's expression did not change. Thank you, he said. Please wait in the conference room. Ezinne entered last. Her answers were simple, her examples local, her accomplishments, the kind that don't break headlines but keep neighborhoods from collapsing. The director listened with the same poker-faced attention, then handed her the stack. In the shredding room, she hummed under her breath to quiet the noise in her head. When she found the money, she didn't look at the ceiling for cameras or at the corners for witnesses. She looked at her palms. People underestimate how much your hands can tell you the truth. Hers had learned honesty the slow way, one small choice at a time, long before anyone noticed. She put the money back in the envelope and carried it out. Sir, she said, this was misfiled. Thank you, he said. Exactly as before, exactly as if this had all been inevitable. They assembled later in the main conference room, around a round table that reflected faces back to themselves. Conversations trailed off into a hush when the door opened. The HR director entered with the tall man again. He clicked a remote. A screen at the front of the room brightened to a still image of the shredder's mouth. Somebody exhaled too loudly. Another person's chair creaked as if trying to back away. If there's one thing I value, the director said, voice steady enough to iron the air, it's evidence. The footage played. Kendra's face turned a paler shade of poise as the camera showed her tucking money where she thought the world would never look. That's illegal, she snapped, brittle. Privacy. The director raised an eyebrow without moving anything else on his face. We'll note your concern. Dapo's hesitation played next. He didn't look ashamed, only annoyed at the camera's lack of tact. Then Amara, the weight in her hands, the pause at the door, the walk that refused to mimic guilt. Finally, Ezinne's quiet decision, simple as water finding the straightest path downhill. This wasn't about money, the director said, when the screen went blank. It was about the difference between returning what isn't yours because you're asked, and returning what isn't yours because it isn't yours. The door at the side of the room opened. An older woman stepped in, no longer stooped, no longer barefoot, no basin on her head. A tailored dress in a deep, unmoving blue. Glasses that didn't hide, but announced the intelligence behind them. Grace in the bones, authority in the air around her. A chair scraped the floor as Ezinne stood involuntarily. Mama, she whispered, a private word that escaped into a public room. The woman smiled at her first, then at everyone else. "No one here calls me that," she said gently. "Here they call me Miss Adara Okoye." A name moved through the room like a ripple that knew it would become a wave. Heads turned toward the tall man in his 50s. He inclined his head, not as a subordinate, not as a superior, but as a person who was, for this moment, a piece of someone else's reveal. "I don't hire resumes," Ms. Okoye said. "Not at this stage. I hire character." Silence balanced on the table edge, like a glass that might fall if anyone breathed too hard. She walked behind chairs without stopping, a slow orbit that made everyone feel briefly inspected and briefly invisible. When she reached Amara, she paused. "You passed the test before you put down that envelope," she said softly, a smile warming her words. "You passed it when you decided what kind of story you want to be able to tell. Yourself about yourself." Amara didn't trust her throat to answer, so she nodded. Ms. Okoye's eyes shifted to Ezinne. "And you," she said, something like pride shading her tone. "The world didn't clap when you helped me at the gate. You did it anyway." She stepped back, letting the room breathe again. "Both of you are hired," she said, not loudly, but with a finality that changed the weight of everyone's shoulders. "And you will be trained for roles higher than what you came here for. We'll discuss details privately." Kendra began to speak, then swallowed the words. Dapo adjusted his cuff and stared at the blank screen as if a different edit might appear and reveal a version of events that put him in a better light. "Meeting adjourned," the HR director said, voice still even, as if none of this was remarkable, and all of it was, at the same time. Outside the conference room, the air felt different. Possibility is like that. It shifts the chemistry of oxygen. That might have been the end of the story, if the story had been about a single test and a neat reveal. But character doesn't end with a pass mark. It keeps asking the same question in different disguises. Who are you when no one is watching? The first week felt like learning to breathe in a thinner atmosphere. Onboarding, tours, names that slipped like fish, systems that had to be felt before they could be understood. Amara discovered that the company's corridors carried sound farther than expected. People learned more by listening than by asking. Ezinne discovered that the break room had unspoken territories, tables where interns were invisible and tables where they were scenery. Ms. Okoye met them separately, then together. In her office, the city's hush pressed against the windows, and the walls held framed lines that were not motivational. Quotes, but pieces of plain truth. "You'll be noticed now," she said, hands steepled, eyes kind. "Some of that will feel like sunlight. Some of it will feel like surveillance. Both are tests. Be steady." They were assigned to a strategic operations group, the sort of team that touches nearly everything and is visible to nearly no one. The manager, a precise man named Bamidele, dispensed instructions like a pharmacist finding just the right dosage. The team, a quick-witted analyst named Tola, who believed speed was a virtue even when it sprinted past accuracy. A quiet engineer called Kunli, who made silence feel like an improvement over speech. A project coordinator, Remy, who smiled with his mouth but rarely with his eyes. On day 3, Bamidele slid a file across a table toward Amara. "We've got a vendor qualification to finalize," he said. "2 finalists. I want a comparative matrix by noon." She spent the morning inside the numbers until the numbers told stories. One vendor had better pricing and on-time delivery history. The other brought gift baskets that lingered at reception like expensive perfume. By 11:30, her matrix said something she didn't want it to say. The clear winner was the company whose representative kept mispronouncing her name and calling her dear. She presented the matrix. Bamidele nodded, non-committal. "Thank you," he said. "Leave it with me." At 4, Amara overheard laughter outside an office and saw the gift basket move down the hall like a parade float. By 5, she heard someone say, "We're going with the second vendor." Her stomach didn't drop. It tightened. She told herself she might not have the full picture. People used that phrase when they were trying to talk themselves out of the obvious. On day 5, a message arrived in her inbox that did not belong. It was polite, friendly, and shaped itself like a helping hand. Congrats on your new role, Amara. If you're looking to stand out early, align with how decisions are really made. Lunch? No pressure. Or, no last name, no extension. She clicked the profile. A thin LinkedIn presence, one photo, a headline that said, Advisor. She closed the window. The cursor blinked at her like it had something to say. Ezinne's tests came quieter. A stack of invoices to reconcile, a line item that refused to make sense. She traced it back to a purchase order that had changed shape between approval and fulfillment. A digit altered, an extra zero trying to pass as a smudge. She flagged it and sent a note with questions. The reply arrived quickly, curt. It's fine. These things happen. Close it out. She didn't. She built a short trail of breadcrumbs, a clean log, a copy of the original PO, a highlight on the altered figure, then walked them to Bamidel's desk. Heart in throat. He looked at the printouts, jaw set, then at her. Leave this with me. 2 hours later, the altered line disappeared from the system. No apology, no conversation. Ezinne told herself that sometimes the best outcome is a quiet one. But something in her chest filed the moment under unfinished. A week turned into 3. Ms. Okoye summoned them again. She never asked small talk to do work it wasn't built for. What have you learned, she said. That speed is not the same as clarity, Amara said. That silence is not the same as peace, Ezinne said. A smile touched the corner of the CEO's mouth. Good, she said. Most people need years to notice those two. She assigned them a project with edges sharp enough to cut. A cross-functional audit of an internal process that had lived too long in shadows. You'll meet resistance, she said. Smile at it, then keep going. They went. Doors opened because her name was on the memo, and doors closed because her name was on the memo. They learned how to phrase a question so it wouldn't be mistaken for an accusation, even when it was one. They learned that in every department, there is at least one person who survives by wearing righteousness as a coat, and one who survives by keeping their virtue in a drawer, where nobody thinks to look. 3 findings emerged from the fog. First, a discrepancy in inventory that had no appetite for explanations. Second, a vendor relationship that felt more like a private friendship than a public contract. Third, a pattern of approvals that clustered at odd hours, as if hoping the world would be too tired to care. They took the findings to Bamidele, who looked like a man trying to figure out which wire could be cut without the building going dark. Thank you, he said. The way people say thank you when they wish the gift had not arrived. That night, as Amara packed her bag, the lights flickered not in the ceiling, but in her phone. Another message from Our Good Instincts today. The inventory gap isn't yours to fix. If you push too hard, you'll draw heat you don't deserve. There are better ways to make a name for yourself. Coffee? She deleted the message. Then she went to the window and watched the city's lights. Practice belonging to someone else. When she turned back, Ms. Okoye was standing in her doorway. I like offices at night, the CEO said, stepping in as if invited. They tell the truth when they think no one's listening. Amara's hand hovered over her bag. Ma'am, she said, straightening. I hear you're finding things, Ms. Okoye said. Not a question. Good, keep finding. But remember, don't light a match without knowing where the smoke will go. Understood. The next morning, Ezinne found a sealed envelope on her chair. No name. Just a small, neat line of handwriting. For your mother's medicine. Inside, money. Not a fortune. Exactly enough to sound like compassion and smell like leverage. She held it like it might stain. She looked around the empty room, then at the camera in the corner. Wondered if it saw small envelopes too. She put the money back, sealed the flap and walked. The HR director looked up when she entered, as if he'd been expecting a different sort of visitor. She set the envelope down where formal things belong. Someone thought I needed help, she said. You do, he said without inflection. But not like this. By the end of that week, the audit had voices. Anonymous ones, brave ones, whispering ones that wanted to be sure their words would not expose their necks. They all leaned toward the same truth. Lines had been crossed that people pretended were blurry. The final presentation sat on a table in the conference room like a bright, sharp object. Amara and Ezinne stood side by side. Not because the optics mattered, but because the stance did. The HR director and Bamadel were there. The tall man, 2 board members with calculating eyes. And at the end, seated with the stillness of a decision already made, Ms. Adara Okoye. They spoke, not quickly, not slowly, just the speed of a story that knows it's true. Slides turned, numbers held, patterns refused to dress as coincidence. When they finished, the room was a shape cut from quiet. "Thank you," Ms. Okoye said, and the words carried not relief, but resolve. "We'll proceed." Many things happened fast after that. Security badges deactivated, contracts rebid, emails archived with more care than they'd been written. People shifted in their seats, the way people do when their furniture is finally the right size. And then, like mist lifting, an ordinary day began to show through again. A month later, Amara parked a car that was new enough to smell like a promise, and her mother waved from a balcony. With a joy that looked almost surprised to see itself alive, Ezinne's mother's medicine bottles lined a shelf in neat rows that felt like a rebuke to scarcity. Paychecks arrived like bridges instead of lifeboats. In the CEO's office, documents were signed. Among them, a will with an addition that wasn't loud but would change the weather of more than one life. To Amara Nwoke and Ezinne Opara, whose integrity I've witnessed in rooms both crowded and empty, I bequeath. The words never learned to brag. They just sat, steady in ink that would outlast them all. You'd think that would be the last test. It never is. Another envelope appeared weeks later, this time in Amara's mailbox at home. No cameras to witness, no office corridors to hear a footstep. Inside, a note and a small metal key. "Storage unit. Row C, locker 14. Proof you need, use it well." And there the story begins to ask its question again, in a new accent. When help comes from a hand you don't trust, do you take it if it leads to the truth? Amara met Ezinne at the edge of a decision. They went together because some doors should never be opened alone. The storage unit smelled like dust and resignation. Inside, boxes, ledgers, old laptops that hummed with the ghosts of emails sent too late at night. They found what they were promised, proof tied in a bow of timestamps and signatures. They took it to the HR director first. He listened, eyes scanning the evidence the way doctors scan a chart. Before they decide on a surgery they hope won't be fatal, then he made the call. Another wave of consequences rolled through the building. Less dramatic this time because people had learned how to stand when the ground moved, when the water calmed. A pattern remained. In a world that often rewards the illusion of virtue, the stubborn practice of it still rearranges the furniture. On a day that felt like an answer, Ms. Okoye called them in again. She asked no questions. She gave no speeches. She simply stood, walked around the desk, and hugged them both like a woman who had bought a basin of water and found a river instead. "Character is a lonely thing," she said, pulling back, her hands on their shoulders. "But it attracts its own kind eventually. That's the miracle, not the rewards, the company." Outside her office, the world did what it always does. Counted the wrong things, applauded at the wrong times, forgot to notice the smallest acts that keep everything from falling apart. But in certain rooms, with certain people, the right measurements were being made. A voice spoke up when silence tried to pose as loyalty. An envelope returned to the desk it had no business leaving. If you're looking for the lesson, it's not hidden. Integrity isn't what you say you believe. It's the story you write one unobserved moment at a time. It's what survives you after your name stops being said in rooms you thought you couldn't live without. And sometimes, when the world happens to be watching, the hidden story stands up, smooths a tailored dress in a deep, unmoving blue and says, without needing to be loud, "I don't hire resumes. I hire character." The day after Ms. Okoye's quiet but deliberate hug, the office corridors felt different for Amara and Ezinne. It wasn't that people suddenly spoke to them more, though some did, out of politeness or curiosity. It was the way conversations seemed to pause when they walked into a room. Some of the pauses were respectful, others were not. In an organization where survival often depended on blending into the background, they were now unmistakable shapes. People remembered their faces from the footage in the conference. A room the test that had humiliated some and exalted others. And while the CEO's approval was the company's highest currency, it was also a weight, a shadow that followed. By Wednesday morning, Amara noticed how certain colleagues now gave her half smiles instead of full ones. A few who used to speak freely around her now tightened their sentences, as though weighing each word before letting it out. She couldn't tell if they were afraid she'd report their casual gripes to Ms. Okoye, or simply resentful that she had jumped the ladder. She mentioned it to Ezinne over lunch, sitting in the far corner of the cafeteria where voices softened into a low hum. "It's like I'm a glass of water everyone's afraid to spill," Amara said, poking at the rice on her plate. Ezinne's laugh was low and without malice. "That's not fear. That's politics. They're adjusting to you. Some will keep their distance because they think being close to you is dangerous. Others will try to get close because they think you're a shortcut. You have to figure out which is which. How do I do that? You watch. And you remember that character isn't just for tests in shredding rooms." That week brought another challenge, subtle this time, wrapped in the folds of everyday work. Bamidel assigned them to review a logistics partner's quarterly performance. The partner was large, well-connected, and known for sending gifts during festive seasons. As Amara combed through the report, she found small discrepancies, delivery dates that didn't match invoices, fuel charges that seemed to have been multiplied, and in one case, payment for a shipment that was never logged as received. She flagged them for review. Hours later, she received an email from an address she didn't recognize. "Amara, some of these things are better left off the report. Let's not make unnecessary trouble. Trust me, it's how the game is played." There was no signature, just a small company logo at the bottom. She stared at it for a long time. The first time she had been tested, the choice had been clear: a stranger's money, hers to return or take. This was different. No camera, no clear villain. Just the invitation to adjust something small. That night, she printed the discrepancies, stapled them neatly, and slid them into a file marked "Pending Review." She placed the file directly on Ms. Okoye's desk before leaving for the day. Ezinne faced her own trial 2 days later. She was asked to process an urgent vendor payment, supposedly for a rush order of essential supplies. The invoice amount was unusually high. She cross-checked it against the purchase order and found the quantity had been doubled without any documented approval. When she pointed this out to the accounts officer, the man waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, the approval will come. Just push it through. You'll make life easier for everyone." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could have done it in 10 seconds. Instead, she closed the file, stood, and walked it over to Bamidel. He frowned, flipping through the papers. "Leave it with me." The next morning, the payment was gone from her task list. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just the quiet removal of a problem someone had hoped she'd help hide. 2 weeks later, Ms. Okoye summoned them both. Her office was filled with warm light, and on her desk sat a single envelope. She gestured for them to sit. "You've both been walking into small storms lately." "No," she said, her eyes moving between them. "And you've both kept your footing." "That's not luck, it's a choice." She pushed the envelope forward. Inside were 2 invitations embossed with the company's seal. "This is for the annual executive retreat. Most staff never see it. It's where the real conversations happen, about direction, partnerships, even leadership succession." Amara blinked. "Succession?" The corner of Miss Okoye's mouth lifted. "You'll see." The retreat was held at a discreet private estate, the kind of place where quiet wealth hides behind manicured lawns and old stone walls. From the moment they arrived, Amara and Ezinne could feel eyes on them, curious, appraising, weighing whether they belonged. They were the youngest attendees by far. The first evening, after a series of polite introductions and guarded small talk, a man in a tailored grey suit approached them. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "I've heard quite a bit about you two," he said, his gaze resting on Amara. "A Daora speaks highly of your moral compass." There was a faint undertone to the word moral that didn't sound like praise. "And you are?" Ezinne asked. He introduced himself as the head of a major regional partner. "I'll give you some free advice," he said, lowering his voice. Too much honesty is bad for business. Learn when to look away. He left them with that sentence hanging between them like smoke. Later that night, in the quiet of their shared guest suite, Amara said, "You ever think maybe people are right? That integrity isn't enough to survive in these places." Ezinne shook her head. "Integrity isn't about surviving. It's about deciding who you are, no matter where you end up." What neither of them knew was that this retreat was more than networking. It was the stage for Ms. Okoye's second, far deeper test. By the final day, both women would be placed in situations that would tempt them in ways money never could. This time, the stakes would not be cash in an envelope, but loyalty, influence, and the power to rewrite their own future. And someone at that retreat was already planning to make sure they failed. The morning of the final day of the retreat arrived with a kind of hush that didn't feel accidental. Conversations at breakfast were shorter, the smiles tighter, and Ms. Okoye was nowhere to be seen. Amara and Ezinne found themselves at a long table set up on the lawn, papers and folders stacked neatly at each seat. A tall man they'd never met before, sharp suit, sharper voice, stood at the head of the table. "Today's exercise," he began, "is about real-world decision-making under pressure. You'll each be given a scenario based on an actual challenge this company has faced. You have 1 hour to review the file and submit your recommendation." The folders were passed down the table. When Amara opened hers, her breath caught. Inside was a proposal from a high-profile supplier with a glittering reputation. The deal offered enormous profit margins, and the company's executives had already penciled it into the next year's projections. But tucked near the back of the file, almost like an afterthought, was a compliance report. The supplier had been flagged for unethical labor practices, subcontracting to workshops that underpaid workers and, in some cases, used child labor. If she recommended rejecting the deal, it would mean months of lost revenue and possibly angering influential partners. If she approved it, she'd be endorsing exploitation quietly, on paper, with no one outside the room ever knowing. Ezinne's folder was different but just as treacherous. It contained a confidential internal report detailing cost overruns on a flagship project. The overruns were the result of mismanagement by a senior executive, a man who, she realized with a sinking heart, was sitting just 3 seats away. The instructions at the front of the folder were clear. She was to draft a brief statement for an upcoming shareholder meeting, either disclosing the overruns in full or omitting them entirely. Ivie's voice dropped. "Osagi killed your father." Egosa nodded. "And now we'll bury him legally, but we do it your way. Not fast, not loud, but final." For the first time since she faked her death, Ivie smiled. The plan began. 2 days later, Aoife received a sealed letter. It was from Barrister E. Itibor. She opened it and gasped. Inside was a short note. "Aoife, your sister is alive. Do not tell anyone. She needs you. Come to the address below at 8 p.m. Come alone." She stared at the paper. Her heart stopped. Could it be? Could Ivie be alive? She grabbed her handbag and ran. When Aoife arrived at the quiet bungalow, the door opened before she knocked. There stood her sister, alive, glowing, and stronger than ever. For a moment they said nothing. Then they both broke down. They hugged for what felt like forever. Aoife cried uncontrollably. "You came back," she whispered. "I never left," Ivie replied. They sat inside and talked for hours. Aoife poured out everything. How their parents betrayed her. How Osagi mocked her. How Blessing spat lies. Ivie listened. Every word another nail in the coffin she'd soon build, not for herself, but for the people who buried her too early. The next morning, Barrister Egosa sent a legal notice to all stakeholders. Official will reading of the late Mrs. Ivie Udwagan, rescheduled Saturday. Non, Udwagan Estate, Girai, Benin City. The city buzzed. The lawyer was new. The case was heated. Rumors flew. Osagi received the notice with a smirk. He leaned back, holding a glass of champagne. "Finally," he said. "Time to claim what's mine." Blessing hugged him from behind. "When it's over, let's disappear. Somewhere far." Osagi kissed her. After Saturday, Nigeria becomes history. But that same Saturday morning, just before dawn, Osagi received a text. "Be on time today. The dead are never late." He stared at the screen. No number, no name. His hands shook. At exactly 12 noon, the Uduagan mansion was packed. Chairs lined the massive living room. The ACs hummed. A few journalists lurked outside. Osagi wore a navy suit. Blessing wore a silk black gown. They entered confidently. Chief and Madame Uduagan arrived separately. They barely spoke to each other. Their shame was heavy. Ivie walked in last, calm, dignified. Then Barrister Igosa rose. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Before I read this will, I must clarify something." Everyone leaned forward. The deceased, Mrs. Ivie Uduagan, is not deceased. Gasps exploded. Before anyone could react, the front doors opened, and in she walked. Alive, elegant, unapologetic. Ivie. Osagi stumbled backwards. Blessing dropped her purse. Madame Uduagan screamed. Chief Uduagan crossed himself in fear. Ivie smiled through tears. Ivie walked to the center. "Good afternoon. I'm sorry to interrupt your funeral plans, but as you can see, I'm not dead, just deeply disappointed. Omitting them would protect the executive's reputation and keep shareholder confidence intact for now. Disclosing them could trigger a backlash that might destabilize the project and her standing in the company. The test wasn't spoken aloud, but it hung in the air. Would they protect the company's image at the expense of truth, or protect the truth at the expense of the company's short-term comfort? The hour ticked down. Amara stared at the page detailing the supplier's labor practices. The safe choice was to recommend approval and bury the compliance. Report in further review notes. But her father's words returned, as insistent as they'd been the day of the envelope. Your character is the part of you that survives every job, every title, every storm. She wrote her recommendation: reject supplier, ethical, risks outweigh projected revenue, recommend immediate search for alternative partners. She signed it, slid it into the folder, and closed it. Ezinne reread the cost overrun report 3 times, searching for a way to present the truth without detonating the project's public image. There wasn't one. She wrote, full disclosure recommended. Transparency will preserve long-term shareholder trust and ensure corrective action on mismanagement. Her hands shook as she placed the statement in the folder. She knew the executive would know exactly who had exposed him. When the hour ended, the folders were collected without comment. The tall man left the table without another word. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of polite goodbyes and suitcases rolling across polished floors. Amara and Ezinne returned to their shared suite, uncertain whether they'd passed, failed, or simply been forgotten in a test no one had promised to explain. Back at headquarters the following week, the summons came. Both women were called to the main boardroom, a space they'd never entered before. Inside sat Ms. Okoye at the head of the table, the tall man from the retreat beside her, and several board members, including the senior executive from Ezinne's report. His expression was unreadable. Ms. Okoye gestured for them to sit. "What you didn't know," she began, "is that the scenarios you faced at the retreat were based on real cases from this company's past. In both cases, the wrong choice was made at the time. We lost good people, and we compromised values we should have defended." She looked first at Amara. "You rejected a deal that would have made us millions because you saw what it would cost in human dignity. That was the right call." Then to Ezinne, "You exposed a mistake that could have been hidden, knowing it might cost you influence here. That too was the right call." Her gaze swept the boardroom. For those wondering, yes, these were tests. And yes, they matter more to me than any revenue projection. The senior executive cleared his throat, as if to speak, but Ms. Okoye raised a hand. "We're done here." When the others had filed out, she leaned back in her chair, the steel in her posture softening. "I put you through those tests for a reason. This company has enough people who know how to make money. We need people who know how to protect its soul." She slid 2 envelopes across the table. Inside each was a formal promotion letter, senior roles in strategic operations, reporting directly to her. Months passed. Amara and Ezinne grew into their roles, earning trust from teams that had once doubted them. They faced new challenges, some public, others hidden, and passed smaller, everyday tests without fanfare. One evening, Amara received a message from Ms. Okoye's assistant, summoning her to the CEO's office after hours. Ezinne had been called too. When they arrived, Ms. Okoye was standing by the window looking out over the city. "I'm not immortal," she said, turning to face them. "And I don't intend to leave the future of this company to chance. You've proven your integrity twice, once when no one was watching, and once when everyone was." She opened a leather-bound folder and handed them each a document. It was her will. "To Amara Nwoke and Ezinne Opera," it read, "I leave a portion of my estate and a controlling interest in Megatron Associates. May you guard it not as owners but as stewards of its values." For a moment, neither of them could speak. "This isn't a reward," Ms. Okoye said quietly. "It's a responsibility, and it will be the hardest test yet." They left her office that night in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on their shoulders. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant eyes, watching to see what they would do next. The tests would never end, but neither would their choice, because integrity isn't a single decision. It's the habit of choosing what's right, over and over again until it becomes who you are. What do you think about Amara and Ezinne's journey? If you were in their shoes, faced with decisions that could change your life forever, would you have chosen integrity or taken the easy way out? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you think twice about the power of character, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring, thought-provoking stories like this one. Until next time, stay kind, stay true, and remember, your character is your legacy.